Welcome, everyone, to a good place where truth and integrity meet. Every week, I introduce you to thought provoking and compelling premier educators, politicians, whistleblowers, best selling authors, journalists, activists, and celebrities. They all have one thing in common: they're people of truth and integrity, and many are considered modern day heroes, like the guest I have today. His name is Dr. Matthew Arnegaard, and he has a Master of Science degree in environmental toxicology from Virginia Tech and a PhD in neurobiology and behavior from Cornell University. Prior to receiving those degrees, he was a recipient of the prestigious Fulbright Fellowship, which he used for studies and research in chemical engineering in Germany. Dr. Arnegaard has worked in research institutions in Austin, Seattle, and Vancouver, Canada. He has authored 35 peer reviewed publications in top tier science journals. And today, Dr. Arnegaard is speaking to me from Washington, D.C., where he continues to work in the biomedical field. And I think COVID-19 is keeping him very busy at the moment. But I want to focus on people who call themselves targeted individuals or refer to themselves as people who are targeted. And these are new emerging crimes that are exponentially growing. These crimes, which have little to no redress, are finally reaching center stage. A couple of examples are the fact that the United Nations are addressing this serious issue. There was also recently held press conference in Canada with the local police sharing and acknowledging details and information about these crimes. And the powerhouses of whistleblowing, Bill Binney and Kirk Wiebe, going public with their knowledge of these crimes, which are topics that Matt knows a lot about. Can you tell us what targeting is and how you came to find out about this topic?
Sure. Hi, Ella. How are you? Thank you for that introduction. It's a pleasure to be on your show today. About the targeted individual phenomenon, I learned about it because I was a victim of targeting crimes up in Vancouver, Canada. And basically, that was so violating to me that it inspired me to work on raising awareness and trying to turn the situation around, because so many people are being hurt, and that's why I teamed up with you. And just in a nutshell, to describe the issue, there's two arms to the crime. These harassment networks, which can be various entities.
Can I interject just really quickly? I just wanted to add a little context. So these are crimes which have had little or no address and are finally reaching center stage. And when I say that, I can give you a couple of examples. United Nations are addressing the serious issues, and there was recently held conference in Canada with the local police sharing and acknowledging details and information about these crimes. And the powerhouse whistleblowers Bill Binney and Kirk Wiebe have gone public with their knowledge of these crimes as well. And again, I'll go back to you. I just want to give everybody a little more background information and let people know that these are very serious crimes that have not been addressed until just recently.
Sure. I would say they're moving towards center stage, but we're not at center stage yet. But there's definitely promising movement in that direction. But just to describe briefly, these are highly complicated crimes, and they, as I was saying, they involve two sort of modes in general. The different entities that engage in harassment for hire or harassment to silence people because they threaten the entities, either their business or they threaten to expose crimes on whatever entities are doing this. There's multiple different types of entities that are doing this, and they either engage in organized stalking and or what we call electronic harassment. I think the best way to describe organized stalking, it sort of is self-explanatory, but over the past few years, there's been some articles in the news. But I will say that on the electronic harassment side, that term really doesn't do the crime justice. What we're really talking about here is using focused energy-emitting devices that are similar to directed energy devices used by the military and law enforcement, but they're obviously being used by criminals, and there's obviously some kind of way that they can get their hands on these sort of lower tech or more available devices. But focused energy, which we think is largely radio frequency microwave energy, has all kinds of harmful, painful, and debilitating effects on the body. And of course, the energy can pass through a lot of materials. So the crimes can be carried out while you are in your home. So they're incredibly invasive. and incredibly violating. And for the most part, they don't leave very much evidence, which is why we've had such trouble getting these crimes exposed, even though, by all accounts, they're happening to many thousands of people all around the world.
And maybe we can go into some examples about what people endure. I understand you're a victim yourself, as are many people, and myself as well. So I think maybe just giving a little more detail about some of the examples.
Absolutely. These are kind of like 21st century crimes, although the crimes did start happening at the end of the last century, but they're really ramping up. And what's really fascinating is that for those who know the magnitude and the extent of these crimes, if you pay attention to mainstream news reports, there's actually a lot out there that really is speaking to these crimes, but the media and law enforcement haven't linked those to the reports, mostly on social media, of tens of thousands of people. And yeah, sure, I'll give you some examples. And as I said before, organized stalking is pretty difficult to describe. In a nutshell, it uses many organized people that carry out small acts of harassment, for the most part done under the public's eye. And each small act of harassment may look like an ordinary instance of an unlucky occurrence or an accident, but to the victim, they combine into a sustained campaign that really amounts to, in many cases, psychological torture. So one example, I don't know if you heard about this one, just a week and a day ago, the Calgary Herald had a story in it titled "Appeal Court Upholds Convictions of Two Calgary Police Officers in Stalking Case." These officers tried to appeal the judgments against them. And going back to the actual story, this involved former Calgary Police Service members Bradford Robert McNish and Brian Allen Morton. And they were paid to conduct surveillance on the former girlfriend of Calgary businessman Kenneth Robert Carter. And Carter paid hundreds of thousands of dollars to have Akele Taylor, I think that's how you say her name, tailed in a surveillance effort coordinated by unlicensed private detective Steve Walton, who was a former member of the police force. In total, 3 active Calgary police officers, 1 former police officer, 1 former civilian member of the service, and 1 citizen were charged in this crime on June 15th, 2016. And what they did was an organized harassment for hire campaign against this woman involving group stalking, bribery, illegal surveillance, police corruption, unauthorized use of a computer, and improper access of police databases to gain private information about the victims in order to facilitate this multi-stalker stalking and organized harassment. And really, this was a persistent 2-year campaign of targeted intimidation. And it involved placement of a GPS tracker on Akele's car. Akele's friends were offered money in exchange for damaging information on her. And the offenders, who were sworn to serve and protect the public, searched for damaging information on Calgary Police Service databases. And some of the offenders still await sentencing, I believe, on July 30th.
That was actually one of the references I was making, but I stated in a very general way.
Right. I thought so. And what about Harvey Weinstein? I know you know about that story.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, it really had impact, and it actually helped the Me Too movement. It's just an example of women trying to gain equal rights to me. And it just brought a lot of attention to the abuses women endure with high-powered bosses and high-powered companies just to get ahead. And of course, we can refer to Roger Ailes, who used to own and used to run Fox News. So what he did and what crime he was committed for opened the door in the conversation to other similar situations of harassment that women have had to endure.
Yeah, he should have been committed because he's insane for what he did to those women. He's an insane narcissist. But just to update the audience, because I know you know this case inside and out, when the women started making allegations against Weinstein, he hired Black Cube, which is a private security agency run by former Mossad agents. And they engaged in acts that were an attempt to intimidate the victims and to intimidate reporters who were interested in the story, to try to keep them quiet about the allegations against Weinstein. As you are definitely aware, but I want to make it clear to those listening, it's not just very wealthy people that can co-opt harassment for hire companies. There's also a lot of other harassment for hire companies on the internet that offer services that are much less expensive to clients with less money than Weinstein.
I understand that. And, these principles or the way that these are organized can actually be the ideas can be implemented by corporations, private entities, and possibly some government involvement.
Yeah, there's a whole lot of different entities. Certainly, I believe that the crimes, in my view, are criminal methodologies, and in the case of electronic harassment and also organized stalking, the use of technologies available and emergent technologies. Why would those be only limited or available to only one entity? So
Exactly.
I generally look at it as organized crime. My personal case, which I don't have time to get into today, was an organized crime entity, which I witnessed activity that they were engaged in, and they went after me with mostly with electronic harassment, but also some organized stalking, which was extensive and involved a lot of people in order to keep me from reporting their activities and to run me out of town. But hey, Ella, did you see Leah Remini's award-winning series on A&E called Scientology in the Aftermath?
Absolutely, I did. Several people had recommended it, and I have to say it runs parallel, if not precisely what people who purport these crimes are saying.
Yeah, it shows that organized stalking tactics and possibly the tracking, apps and tracking technologies can be used by a lot of people. That series got into that fair game principle of Scientology, which is basically a practice that they use to do organized stalking. I mean, it's shown in her show, and organized intimidation and harassment of defectors from the church. And that's to intimidate them into not speaking negatively about the church.
Yeah, and who knows how, that entity, Scientology, has probably over $1 billion at their fingertips.
Right, absolutely. I think the examples that we're seeing in the news are kind of like the stunning examples from police corruption. When it gets to a certain magnitude, it's obvious and there's evidence, and the entities doing it are, particular entities that I guess would be in the limelight to a certain degree. But the run-of-the-mill organized stalking, which is rampant, is really not being dealt with, which is a shame, because the examples that we're discussing are, for every one that gets into the news, there's 100 more that law enforcement won't do anything about. And,
if not more.
Right,
yes.
If not more. Yeah. But a stunning example, just about 2 or 3 weeks ago, I think a lot of the listeners may have heard about this one because it basically hit all the newspapers, that some high-level eBay executives were charged with waging an extensive harassment campaign to terrorize and intimidate a couple from Natick, Massachusetts. And that couple ran a newspaper that was critical of eBay. But of course, that's their right. Certain people in eBay were not happy about that. These were some high-level executives too, and they engaged in a harassment campaign that amounted to a systematic effort to psychologically torture and destroy the lives of that couple. And it even included sending them live spiders and cockroaches through the mail. I mean, that is sick.
Very much so. And
Right.
And these are very similar to the experiences so many people targeted have explained to me, including animals being killed, break-ins, and even like group stalking, as you were touching upon earlier. And it's very intimidating. I have to say, I've spoken to people on the phone. We have a hotline for people who are experiencing stalking in its many forms.
At the end of the stalking that was done on me, which actually destroyed my life, I had to basically flee for my life from Vancouver. There was a home break-in that happened on me in my apartment there. And, they left a little clue or a little sign so that I would know there was a home break-in. And only later did I find out that my landlord had never changed the keys and that all the security guards in that building had keys. And I'm not saying that the security guards did it, but the key was, it was not hard to break in. I didn't know that at the time. But just on the eBay thing, I just want people to realize these were fairly senior level people. The offenders included James Baugh of San Jose, California, who was eBay's Senior Director of Safety and Security, and David Harville of New York City, who was eBay's Director of Global Resiliency. And there were several other now former eBay employees that were involved. So clearly organized and clearly done to intimidate people into silence. That's one of the motives. There's other motives too. A lot of the people that we speak to, a lot of the victims describe something that could be harassment just for entertainment. It's really hard to wrap your mind around because a lot of effort goes into it and it's really hard to understand. We don't really have a full understanding, but a lot of people do report what almost appears to be harassment for entertainment or kind of like a sexual gratification type motive.
That's not surprising. And then some of it's revenge. And some people I speak to, just lovely people across America and around the world, and they have no idea why they're going through this and why they've been chosen for this level of harassment.
I was going to say there's other motives that come into play with the electronic harassment. That would be the use of the directed energy devices, basically to create different kinds of sensory effects in people, pain, burning sensations, electrocution sensations, and some other motives like potentially people with new toys kind of experimenting with them to see how they work. So experimentation in different ways can come into it. I really want to share one more example, a couple more examples. Here's one. Just yesterday, the BBC reported that over 800 people, including 2 law enforcement officers, were arrested in the UK and Europe after a criminal chat network was discovered. The chat network is or was called EncroChat, and it had around 60,000 subscribers before the operation. And the system operated on specialized phones, and it hid behind a standard-looking operating system. It was hiding on people's phones. And features of the system included encrypted communications, self-destructing messages, and a panic code. If a police officer wanted to enter someone's phone, the person owning the phone could say, sure, here's the code. And then when the police officer entered that code, it would actually wipe the device of all the data. Phil von Hemert, who is the deputy executive director of Europol, he told a press conference in The Hague that the hacking of the network had allowed the disruption of criminal activities, including violent attacks, corruption, attempted murders, and large-scale drug transports. I really find myself wanting to say, and it also allowed organized stalking, psychological torture, and energy weapon attacks. I'm adding that. But my point is that I think sometimes similar communication systems are probably being used by harassment networks that engage in organized stalking.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So let me just quickly go through a couple more examples because I want to move on to the electronic harassment. Let me just wrap it up by saying this. Government-run surveys in the United States, Canada, and the United Kingdom all showed the same thing. And that is about 1 in 8, pretty much 1 in 8, within rounding error, 1 in 8 reporting victims of stalking, of any kind of stalking, 1 out of 8, alleged that they were stalked by multiple offenders simultaneously. And we know how common regular stalking is, or single stalker stalking. For some reason, multi-stalker stalking is ridiculed or regarded as mental illness or conspiracy theory, even though these government reports had 1 in 8 respondents saying that they were stalked by multiple offenders simultaneously. And that U.S. Department of Justice survey reported that a shocking number of respondents said they'd been stalked in an organized fashion by 10 to 50 or more stalkers in the same bout of stalking. That is disturbing.
That is disturbing and quite profound. I wasn't aware of that, of this bit of information.
It's an older survey. I think you know it. It's not a recent one because we have it cited on our webpage, but I think you were just thinking more recently. So what happened was, I think those data are so disturbing that the Department of Justice has not been in a big hurry to repeat that survey because here's what happens. When a type of crime is not counteracted by law enforcement, it breaks down the rule of law. It allows the offenders to act with impunity. It allows them to, improve their techniques, and it allows the growth of that crime. So probably now the response would be even more disturbing. I think there's a reluctance on the part of the Justice Department to counteract this, or local police forces, because the problem is very tricky. It's hard to, put people in jail for this kind of crime because the evidence is so difficult to gather. But eventually this is going to be forced into people's awareness because, the crime is growing because nothing's being done about it.
Absolutely. And what about some of these people that have done nothing wrong, and some of these people that can't think of a single person that would be interested in doing that to them or would have any retaliatory reason to do these to people? I just don't understand why so many people, I mean, we must have spoken to 10,000 people over the past couple of years, and it's just disturbing. So many of these people seem marginalized, and so it's very disturbing to me that and it's harder for people like that to even get a voice. Many people I know have gone to the police and they basically look at them like they have, four eyes. They just are not getting the assistance, and they're quickly written off as possibly with mental illness. When you just stated, you made a reference saying that half the people who reported stalking
one in eight,
sorry, have experienced more than a single person stalking them. And now with technology, there's so many things they can do. And so many people complain of hacking, phone issues. And then there's also the Stingray. A lot of people are, from what I understand, people are complaining about Stingrays attached to their phone, which is easy to find out. You can download an app and it will show you. And a Stingray, maybe you know a little bit about it. You can just give a quick note about that, give a little description.
My understanding is that a Stingray puts out a signal that your phone can connect to for communications purposes. It basically acts as a cell tower, and your phone recognizes it as a cell tower. And because the strength of it is stronger, the law enforcement that are using it, or the criminals, if they have access to buying these on the black market, which I'm pretty sure they can do, some have access to it, they would park outside your house or a block away, and then your phone would recognize it as the strongest available signal and connect to it, which means the pipeline of your data and your calls, your voice is going through their system, so they can they can basically be like a man in the middle attack. And just to be clear, it is possible, and that certain law enforcement agencies could be using these tactics as well.
You are now tuned into the truth frequency.
Your protection from deception. TFR.
Truth Frequency Radio.
Here with Dr. Matthew Arnegard, and we're talking about growing emerging crimes known as either organized stalking and targeting. And right now we're going to go into some electronic harassment, some definitions, some examples, and what that really is all about. Matthew?
Absolutely. Let me just say real quick, I want to give a shout out to Ann and Clarence and their family and friends from Baltimore, Maryland. And they got a flat tire. I helped them out. They're back on their way and they're heading to North Carolina for the 4th of July. So just wanted to say hello to them. I think they're listening right now. But sure, electronic harassment, that is a euphemism. It can be like harassment in many cases, but it goes on for so long that it's much worse than, like, when people think of harassment, they might think of a single bout or a short bout of harassment. But really what this amounts to is assault and battery with energy emitting devices and effects on the body that amount to physical torture and probably in extreme cases, potentially lethal assaults. So it is much more serious than harassment, but electronic harassment seems to be the established term in the community. So we'll use that term. So there are mainstream media reports related to the use of harmful directed energy devices, just like the organized stalking reports that we just talked about. But it's a little bit harder for the general public to relate those stories to the allegations of the many thousands of people who call themselves targeted individuals. But for what it's worth, these are important examples. For one, you can read on the Department of Justice's website, and in many news articles as well, that back in 2015, Glendon Scott Crawford of Galway, New York, was sentenced to 30 years in prison for attempting to produce and use a radiological dispersion device. conspiracy to use a weapon of mass destruction, and distributing information related to weapons of mass destruction. And basically, Crawford and his co-conspirator, Eric Fate of Hudson, New York, planned to modify an industrial X-ray device into an ionizing radiation-directed energy weapon, for the most part. I'm not sure how much it could be focused into a parallel beam, but it was a directed energy weapon, ionizing radiation, X-ray, and they planned to kill Muslims and President Obama. Just to reiterate, the electronic harassment that's experienced by thousands of targeted individuals is probably being carried out with non-ionizing pulsed microwave directed energy devices. But this incident involving Crawford and Fate, it's instructive because it definitely shows that criminals have started to think about energy as a way to harm or even kill people for whatever criminal motives they have. In this case, it was clearly extremism and hate that drove these two criminals. They should have gotten life in prison, in my opinion. So, and then another example is the Cuba incident. You know, I do ask a lot of people about this, and it's surprising that a lot of people they didn't clue in on this. There's a fair number of people out there who didn't cue in on this incident. And these were the so-called sonic attacks that were carried out in late 2016 against U.S. and Canadian government personnel stationed at Havana, Cuba. Basically, pulsed microwaves induces ringing sound in your ear, and it's not just your run-of-the-mill tinnitus. It's a pulsating ringing sound, very loud, quick onset, instantaneous offset. And that's because the pulses of microwaves actually heat your brain tissue up in little bursts, which starts to get the tissue to vibrate. And that soft tissue then actually is creating a vibration or a sound that travels to your ear from the reverse pathway. Instead of coming from the outside into your ear, it's being generated in your tissue and causing your ears to ring through an inside-out pathway. So these were called sonic attacks because that was the primary manifestation that was talked about, this ringing sound in the ears. But there were many other effects, as you can get glimmers of that from the interviews. And there was also an incident that happened in China, too. You know, there was sickness and pain that went along with this, too. And also they found permanent symptoms, yeah. Or I should say, I'm not sure if they were permanent, but they were durable symptoms in the system of balance and also changes to the brain matter. These were two papers published in the Journal of the American Medical Association in 2018 and 2019. I just want to say, to wrap this example up, given these distinctive suite of symptoms that they experienced, the balance problems, the pain, the other effects, and the ringing in the ears, a UC San Diego MD PhD scientist by the name of Beatrice Golomb, she actually recognized it as being a suite of symptoms or a syndrome that was a hallmark of exposure to pulsed radio frequency and microwave energy. And that paper is a peer-reviewed paper published in the Journal of Neural Computation.
And then you had people like Dr. Hoffer in Miami. There were several people, actually a team of doctors that actually worked with the victims of this particular crime, and they were able to gather evidence. Targeted people can gather the same evidence, but because it was a group of employees, government employees, and there was a familiarity with these people, they actually had done extensive testing with it, and they had loss of hearing, concussion-like symptoms, which might be permanent brain damage, as you were alluding to earlier. And so it's just interesting that they were able to do that. But initially, they were calling it hysteria, that these employees were having some psychological breakdown. But they came back to the States and started doing studies, and they were working with these doctors, and they found there was actually evidence.
Yeah, some people in the medical community call that the immaculate concussion, because with energy, you can give someone a concussion from a distance without actually touching them with a blunt force object or any other kind of solid object. So that they call that the immaculate concussion. And yeah, it left traces in their brain. And hey, let's give a big thanks to Dr. Michael Hoffer for treating, reporting victims with the respect and, with the sensitivity that they deserve as victims approaching doctors seeking medical help. And, I know he's getting a lot of targeted individuals are contacting him. He's a hero, in my opinion.
I agree with that. Mm-hmm.
Remember that I went to contribute to the Black Lives Matter protest in Washington, D.C. on June 6th? I told you about that situation.
Yes. And
Yes.
you were able to obtain quite an interesting photograph.
It was a National Guard soldier, and the National Guard was on hand. They were just basically deployed, but they did not do anything. They were just stationed there on the streets. And I was at 17th and L Street Northwest, and there was a Humvee with a millimeter wave weapon mounted on the top. And it was fascinating to me that a lot of people didn't recognize it as a microwave weapon, a millimeter wave weapon. It's called the active denial system. And it was there. And basically, they at a low level, they can pulse that or, do little bursts of energy on people. It's been reported in the media that it makes you feel like you're on fire. But I think they can turn the gain down or the amplitude down, and they can use it just to disperse people. It's highly effective. But it's funny to me that there's not a national conversation about this. And I'm surprised that the media didn't even report it, because it's a little bit shocking, no pun intended, that a microwave energy weapon is on hand in DC to be used against citizens if the need arises. I find that disturbing because these are weapons that leave no trace. And so we have to ask questions about accountability. What's to keep those people from just, hey, let's just flick it on for a second? I mean, it wouldn't leave a trace. They could deny it. It has high deniability. Now, I'm not saying that those National Guard troops don't have integrity, but we have to trust that they're going to do the right thing because there's no trace. So when you have weapons out there that leave no trace, that's a potentially dangerous thing. And I think we should at least be having a national conversation about this. And now, from the accounts of all these people that we engage with and that we advocate for, these technologies are being used by criminals. So I think part of the reluctance to having a national conversation is that they don't want to have that conversation about legitimate crowd control weapons. And so they don't want to even open the door to that conversation at all, which means the criminals can fly under the radar because they go, hey, no one's going to talk about this. No one even wants to talk about this. No law enforcement, no elected officials are going to talk about energy weapons. It's a taboo topic, and the criminals are benefiting from it.
Mm-hmm. And anybody participating in these crimes, whether it's somebody that is associated with the government, people that are policemen that are also involved in participating in these, they're still criminals. And these large, huge companies, they're all criminals. They're violating people's human rights. And people are being, for lack of, this word is the right word to use, because these victims, I talk to them all the time, it's torture. It's psychologically torturous as well as physically. And, on Twitter, though, there were like 100,000 retweets and likes on what people were seeing at the protests about this technology and about these weapons that were there. But I heard nothing about it in mainstream.
Well, the Black Lives Matter movement is something I support for what it is, and that is a protest against racism and especially institutional racism. And the other intersecting issue is police misconduct. So I can say absolutely I'm supporting it for those core issues. But I do appreciate that mustering this kind of a protest movement is encouraging to me that one day a similar thing could happen for our issue. And of course, the police misconduct issue opens the door to talking about what is really going on with the police, with the militarization of the police. Emergency services have through-wall radar devices, which are highly invasive and can violate people's Fourth Amendment rights. And that's also an energy weapon issue. Because when people get hit with these energy weapons in their home, it stands to reason that their position is being localized first by what's called a through-wall radar device, which the FCC terms a radio locator or an intentional radiator. There's terminology out there. If you scratch the surface, this issue is rising up in various different ways. And so I'm very encouraged by the Black Lives Matter movement. But just to say, I support it for what it is. And that is people of color being mistreated in that's an understatement. So
murdered. Yes.
Yeah, exactly.
Mhm.
Exactly.
Agreed.
But hey, on the topic of torture, the Human Rights Council released its draft report, which you mentioned at the beginning of our interview. And that was titled Torture and Other Cruel, Inhuman, or Degrading Treatment or Punishment. And the UN Special Rapporteur on Torture was, I think, spearheading that report. And that's
Nils
Nils.
Melzer.
Exactly. I encourage people to read that report if they're interested in this topic. The report is titled Torture and Other Cruel, Inhuman, or Degrading Treatment or Punishment Draft Report. And it's the report of the Special Rapporteur on Torture and Other Cruel, Inhuman, or Degrading Treatment or Punishment. That was a 24 February to 20 March 2020, a 43rd session of the Human Rights Council. And that report, basically, it's a little bit tangential to our issue, but related. Definitely related. That's my opinion. That opinion is not shared by everyone. Other people think it's centrally addressing our issue, but I think it's tangentially addressing our issue. It does talk about ways that people can be harmed by emerging technologies. It mentions no-touch torture. Obviously, torture by energy weapons is torture at a distance, which is no-touch torture. It talks about torture being carried out by both state actors, rogue state actors, and non-state actors, including organized crime. And it coins this term cyber torture. And, it's related to cybernetics, effects on the mind and the senses. So the issue is definite. Our issue, this issue of organized stalking and electronic harassment, is rising up through these media reports, through this UN action. And you know what? It's funny to me, really the action on this should be taken at the local level. There should be local city governments and state governments in our country should be addressing this. And yet somehow it seems to be leapfrogging this. And now it's getting attention by the UN. And that there's this reluctance. What do you think? What's up with that? Why? What's the reluctance of people to do anything about this? Is it just still disbelief that this is happening and that everyone thinks of this as conspiracy theory or mental illness? What do you think's up with that?
I think it's a combination of things. And one of them is that when you search this content online, some very discrediting information comes out. Not that it's not true. It's told that there's stories of testimonies that are online. And sometimes, it's from their perspective, and they're just trying to make sense of these horrific crimes being perpetrated against them. And so sometimes with everybody using a different narrative and having different ideas, because again, it's invisible. You can't see, you can see the stalking, but then you have this other piece with this electronic harassment and these weapons in use. So I think that makes it difficult. So there might be a concern about credibility. The United Nations took thousands of reports from purported targeted individuals. So I think that might be part of the case, that and just also keeping credibility for themselves. And they're basically, so many of the people there are lawyers, and they have to be very careful, and they can't make too many claims that might threaten their standing, is
Right.
what I surmise.
Yeah, the career of an elected official. This is a highly risky issue, and it's the trickiest issue. There's little to no evidence, although in stunning cases, there is evidence, even for the electronic harassment, like those concentric ring resonator waveguide impressions that were dielectrically sort of emblazoned in a laser-like pattern. And these are large. These are essentially beam cross-sections.
Where can people view these? I know you have put videos up about that, showing what you were able to capture with your own camera.
I think you can search on YouTube beam marks in window, and they would find the video that I had. Actually, they featured it on the Travel Channel. Also, I'm not even going to mention. I really don't like the use of that term, so I won't mention it. But search beam marks in window, and then on a show called Legend Hunters, episode 7 of the Legend Hunters. That was also featured there. We have other people sending us examples of those, but still, I wouldn't call that run-of-the-mill evidence that law enforcement could use on a day-to-day basis. Those are only produced under extraordinary
circumstances.
So evidence is one key to the perplexity or the difficulty of this wicked problem. It is interesting when victims of this crime go to the FBI, they are often, they're told different things, but the FBI does not deny the crime. The FBI says, we don't deal with that crime. You need to report that to law enforcement. And then when you report it to law enforcement, one of three things happens. If they're nice about it, this is local law enforcement. If they're professional, the most professional and nice response that you get is, that's above our pay grade, which actually means go back to the FBI. So that's like Joseph Heller would be impressed with the behemoth of the catch-22 that is, where the two levels of law enforcement say, not in my backyard. But law enforcement at the local level can also basically just make fun of you and say, stop wasting our time if they're less professional about it. Or they can actually cause harm by Baker acting people, putting them on psychiatric holds.
There needs to be an education process for police officers now that this is coming to light.
Right.
There needs to be re-education in several areas, as we both know. We just have about 5 minutes just to let you know. So do you want to focus on anything in particular?
Sure, we can wrap it up quickly. My message to the police officers is we have former police officers, we have police officers in training, and I believe we even have some current police officers who are in our support network. They're coming to us. This can happen to police officers and the families of police officers too. And really, when you let crime happen and grow with, to happen with impunity, for the criminals to do their thing with impunity, that threatens the rule of law, which is bad for our country. So these crimes are destructive in many ways. First of all, it's the harm that happens to the victims. The actual direct effects on the victims are that's uncalled for, and I don't want to be in a society that allows victims to be harmed in that way. So that's number one. Number two, when you threaten the rule of law by basically saying there's an area that the justice system won't touch and law enforcement won't touch, that's obviously dangerous because the rule of law is what holds our country together. And then finally, I would say, if this goes on, as this goes on more and more, being unaddressed by institutions that should be addressing this, what that's going to do is contribute to people's mistrust of government. And that's also very bad for our country. And I'll just give you one example to close up. And that is, only 50% of people in a recent survey said that they would take a COVID-19 vaccine once a safe and effective vaccine is developed. And I can tell you there are a whole lot of people working really hard, brilliant people, on developing a safe and effective vaccine. One is coming. One is forthcoming. And only 50% of people said that they'll take it. And 25% of people said maybe. If we don't get 75% of people or more taking the vaccine, we won't benefit from that herd immunity. So the COVID-19 pandemic is a good example, and people's response to it, these people that don't want to take a vaccine, shows that this growing mistrust of government is also bad. And so I really encourage law enforcement and elected officials to start taking care of problems like this when thousands of citizens are saying that there's a problem, because it's harmful to our country in many ways. And I guess I'll just end with that.
And if you feel like you're a victim of these crimes in any capacity, whether you're being stalked, sometimes people experience one or all of what we've discussed here today. And you can always email me at ffti.org@gmail.com, and I can try to send you some more information about this. Again, that's F as in Frank, T as in Tom, I as in Indigo, org@gmail.com. So I just want to say thank you for listening. And one of the best things you can do if you're listening is to have this discussion with others. People need to be made aware that this is happening, because if it is left without any laws or any follow-up, this is just going to grow exponentially. This is going to be huge. And we need to nip that in the butt sooner than later. Just be open-minded. And also, when you hear victims discuss this, know that they're speaking from their perspective and they're trying to make sense out of the nonsensical. And so people do have different ideas what's going on, and who knows who's behind it. Like I said, I believe it's many, many organizations, institutions, companies, private entities as well. So that will also come out, I'm sure, once we have people actually trying to get to the source of this information. But right now, we are just working on people becoming familiar with these crimes so they can stand up on our behalf as well.
Great.
So we still just have a few more seconds, I
Okay,
believe.
great. Well, I just wanted to wish everyone a happy 4th of July. I hope you have a great time tomorrow.